Hello and welcome to another AIC video. So today's video is brought to you by misinformation, or at least bad information. There's been a recent event in news about somebody unfortunately losing their life due to mishandling of a firearm. And I've seen so much information about revolvers specifically that has been either just completely wrong or just not correct. And so I wanted to take a few moments and show you kind of how a revolver works, why you may carry it or not carry it in certain ways, and hopefully enlighten some people with some new knowledge. I am in no way a firearms expert. I just own quite a few guns and I shoot a lot of guns, and I've done my best to be as informed as I can be. The event that happened, we don't know what firearm was being used, other than the fact that based off of the period that the movie is supposed to reflect, leads us to believe that it is more than likely a Colt single action. Don't know if that Colt single action is a newer production with newer safety features, or if it's like an original gun or anything like that. Just don't know. So I'm going to present information about the firearms I have, and I'll let you make whatever inferences you want from there. All right. So the oldest gun I have is this one here, which is my Smith & Wesson 10-5. It was made in the mid 1960s. My second oldest is this one, which is my Smith & Wesson 5906. My oldest pattern gun is my 1911, based off the name. It was originally put into production for the Army in 1911. And this is my newest gun, but it is patterned more or less after a Colt single action Army, but with a lot of modern improvements. So go through each one, kind of looked at the safety features and safety options that these particular firearms have. And this video really is just informative to make you aware of what is out there. So we'll start off with the bullet. This is actually a round. There's a lot of different names for it, but the bullet itself is this copper piece here, and it actually extends into the casing about that far. You can actually see a little bit of a line where it has stretched the casing just a touch. So it's a very tight fit in there. Then this part of the casing is filled with smokeless powder. And on the back here, we have a primer. And the purpose of a gun is there is some mechanism to hit the primer, which then ignites. It lights the smokeless powder. The pressure builds within the chamber and it pushes the projectile, in this case a bullet, out the front of the gun. And the way this is effective, because if you just hit this primer out here with nothing containing it, these two pieces would fly off from each other with equal force, and they would expend almost all their energy immediately. And they're actually, I wouldn't say it's safe. You wouldn't want to do this, but it's actually not as dangerous as you would think it would be. The reason why guns are able to propel this projectile so fast to be deadly is the fact that it holds the pressure behind the projectile, and that accelerates the projectile up to very high speeds. And so that's what makes it be able to accelerate and have the velocity it needs to then do damage to somebody. So a round like this, a cartridge, doesn't have a lot of potential unless it's actually in a firearm. And depending on a lot of factors like barrel length and things like that, can have a big impact on just how effective it is. So with that being said, we'll start off with my oldest firearm here, a revolver. So obviously no rounds in the chamber. This is a single action, double action revolver. That means that if I pull the hammer back, and sorry, I'm doing this around a camera, so my angle's a little bit awkward. If I pull the hammer back, it's a very light click. Like, I put almost no pressure on the trigger at all to fire the weapon, but also I don't have to pull the trigger. to fire the weapon, it's a double action that way. This is my single action. Again, no rounds in the chamber. If I pull the trigger, nothing happens. I have to cock the hammer back, and I pull the trigger a little bit of force, and it goes down. These are technically the same as these. So this is a single action in that, go ahead and drop the slide. With the safeties off, the grip safety and the hammer cocked, it will fire. And then it will cycle itself. When you pull the trigger on this, it actually spins the cylinder to chamber that next round. The cycling of the slide is what chambers that next round and cocks the hammer. This, much like this, is a double action, single action. So if we go ahead and drop the slide. Now this has a magazine safety, so there's no rounds in the magazine, but it won't work unless I have a magazine in it. Single action, hammer is pulled back, and now it's double action. Now, this does require the slide to cycle to chamber that next round. So that's kind of a little bit of function, how they work. Now, as far as safety for these different firearms, go again with the old Revolver here. So you can see right there in that gap, there is nothing there except for just what the cylinder spins on. All right. And it's going to be hard to capture. You can see if I pull the hammer back just part way, it doesn't have a lot of force, and that firing pin does not go through that gap to then engage the primer on the bullet. Now if I go ahead and pull the trigger and I'll hold it, you can see that now the hammer has gone far enough. There's a safety mechanism in here that prevents this hammer from going forward and striking the primer on a round unless the trigger has actually been pulled. So I can push on this as much as I want. I can hit it really hard, and unless I hit it hard enough to actually break internal pieces in here, it's not going to be able to strike the primer on this gun. Now this gun is meant to be carried with all cylinders loaded and just like this, no, the hammer not back, because you're supposed to be able to just be in a double action. On my single action, works a little bit differently, okay? Because it's a single action, to be able to fire the gun, you have to pull the hammer back. Now, you would never carry this with the hammer pulled back. The reason being is now it takes almost no pressure at all to pull the trigger. So if you had this in a bag or something, or you know, even in a holster, and you just barely even brush this trigger, you're going to fire the gun. Okay, so you carry it with the rounds loaded in the chamber, right? You see the little holes there? Rounds in the chamber. And then what you do is just carry it like this, and when you're ready to fire, you pull back and then you pull the trigger. Now you see this bar right here. I'm going to put my thumb on the hammer so you can see that come up. So the safety on this gun is this bar. It's called a transfer bar. So if I let go of the trigger, you can see right here this cutout in the hammer. This part of the hammer hits above the firing pin. That's that little, sorry, focus. That little round thing right there is a firing pin. We'll go over fire pins here in just a second. And so this hammer hits the firing pin, but it can't actually hit the firing pin unless that transfer bar is in the way. So we go ahead and drop the hammer. And we pull it back. You can see the transfer bar starts to come up and is just below the firing pin. So if this were to come forward, it would not hit the firing pin because it would drop that transfer bar. You can see as it comes forward, if I don't have my finger on the trigger, it drops it down, right? So if the hammer were to get released for anything other than my finger being on the trigger, it drops it down. So the hammer can't actually hit that firing pin. And then when I pull the trigger, it brings up that transfer bar, and it stays up only as my finger is on the trigger. Come over to my Smith & Wesson here, kind of the same thing. We'll go ahead and just pull the hammer back so I don't have to rack the slide. You can see back in there, that little black dot is the firing pin. And if I turn the safety, you can see that, it was going to be hard to see because it's going to snap forward, but you can see that there is a metal bar in there that covers the firing pin, and then the hammer goes forward. Now this is in, I could have chambered around, but it is now safe because of the firing pin. Let's talk about that real quick. So in most guns, this is for a rifle, this is much bigger than any of the firing pins in any of these guns. But in most guns, there is a firing pin with a spring, and the firing pin is shorter than the hole it's in. Okay, so and the spring holds it back, and so you have a gap here at the front that the firing pin cannot go through to then hit the primer because the spring is holding it back, and the only thing that will push it through is even just a light pressure won't be enough, because it won't push it to the end of the to the back of the primer because it's too short. So you have to hit this with enough force to overcome the spring and actually have it go through and hit the back of the primer. And so by having this hammer resting on the firing pin, there is no inertia here. There is nothing that will allow the firing pin to then slide through there, overcome the spring, and hit the back of the primer. All right, so you can drop this gun, you can hit the hammer, nothing will happen. Again, unless you hit this gun with significant force to actually do damage, physical damage to the gun. If that's happening, there's other things going on, but you'd have to overcome the inertia of that spring. And I just don't see that happening in any regular, typical use of the gun, not without some extreme force being applied upon it. All right, and we'll look at the last one here, my 1911. This actually has two safeties, all right? You have a thumb safety, which prevents the slide from moving and locks out the trigger, right? If you disengage the thumb safety, you still have a grip safety. And if you're not squeezing the grip, you cannot pull the trigger. It locks the trigger from being pulled. And so while this could hit this, again, there has to be an external force strong enough to do damage, physical damage to the gun, long before that this will release and hit the firing pin. See that right there. And so, and in this case, we have to have a good grip on. You can't just even like hold the gun. You have to actually have a solid, firm grip on it. You have to have your thumb safety off, and then you can pull the trigger, and it will release the hammer. So, again, without knowing exactly the gun that was used, I can only make a guess. But with my knowledge of any gun since the 1911, since the 60s, since the 90s, and today, they all have some sort of safety mechanism that if you're just pulling a hammer back, it's not going to hit that primer. In fact, if you notice, I pull it back a little bit, and if I let go, it's actually out of alignment, and it won't hit anything. It won't hit a primer. I have to have it cocked all the way back before it will be in alignment to be able to hit that primer. So, unless the gun is somehow faulty, damaged, or was somehow mishandled to the extreme that the gun was actually physically damaged, or if it's so the original Colt Army, single action armies, had a firing pin similar to this, where the firing pin was part of the hammer. This is actually replaceable, a little pin there. roll pin, and you could replace that hammer. But unless it was a style that just had zero safety in here at all, and you go to pull it back and you flub the hammer and you let it go, just a lot of factors. We don't know the full details. Obviously, we don't know the make, model, or year of manufacture of the firearm, which makes a big difference. So just wanted to give some knowledge of a few different firearms, how they work, and the safety mechanisms built into firearms, that they don't just randomly go off. That actually is one of the worst things that can happen, is a gun randomly going off. So manufacturers go out of their way to prevent that. Anyways, if you have any thoughts, comments, or questions, leave those down in the comments section down below. I'll do my best to answer. Thank you for watching, and I hope you have an amazing day.